Most of us have heard the story of the golden calf when one of the prophets, I think it was Abraham, was coming down the mountainside after writing down the Ten Commandments. He saw a calf that had been made in gold, and the people were worshiping the calf. And the general gist of the message was, there will be no false gods, no false idols. And if you think about an idol, it is a representation of a deeper reality. One doesn't bow to a golden calf, one bows to the symbology. Perhaps abundant herds were represented in the calf analogy. And while I've never particularly liked the emphasis on singularity, a God that was so insecure, seemingly, that anyone thinking of anyone else for even a few moments would be, smitten and punished and all of that. There is a thread of this that I think is interesting, and the direction, and it's actually is a direction as opposed to an objective final point polarity. But the direction is one of valuing symbol more than substance, or substance more than symbol. And one way to look at this is density, and another is symbol. So on the density level, words are less dense than touch. If I slap you over the head and say I love you, it's probably worse than if I say I hate you and give you everything you desire. In other words, the density of physical matter is preferable to the symbol of that density. Words saying I hate you but giving you all that you desire just means that I've got the meaning of hate wrong. And like many of us have confused love with hate and am pursuing accordingly. So if we look at this direction of symbol or substance, one of the things that holds true out of this metaphor is serve the substance, not the symbol. So what are a few of these different polarity points where we have to choose between something that's more substantive than something that is more symbolic? So money, for example, is great because it's bits of plastic, it's bits of paper, it's numbers. Nobody wants money. What we want are the things that money can buy. And ultimately, of course, we're looking for some form of happiness, some form of meaning and purpose. So in the tension between money and experiences, because, of course, we don't want tables, we don't want fireplaces, we don't want houses. We want the experiences that come into them. Because if we never visited the house, in fact, if you had the choice to spend money on a house that you would never visit, you would never enter, and none of your friends would ever visit, and no one would ever enter. In other words, the house would just be bought, and 10 years later you might sell it or you die, and nobody would have any experiences in the house. The house is useless. So the money is useless until you spend it on something other than digits and paper and plastic. Plastic credit cards, etc. The money is useless until you transform it into a thing or a service. And the service and the thing is useless until you transform it into an experience. Another tension. You have words. This is a hand. And you have the hand. Which do you value more? The word, hand, or an actual hand? And, of course, words are a symbol, or an idol, so to speak, for the denser version of the reality. Words are just a place marker, And they can be anything. In one language, this is called hookah. In another language, it's called pinggan. In another language, it's called hand. It doesn't matter what the sounds are. It's what it's connected to that matters. And so to the extent that a word leads to an experience, the word has value. So the actual thing is more important than the word. The actual experience is more important than the money. Now a list, similarly, you have a list of things to do. Well, is the list of things to do more important than the accomplishments of having done them? The accomplishments are more important than the list. It's a good start to make a list, but the value of the list comes in transforming it into an accomplishment. Now, you also have a tension between action and result, which is more real. If you have to choose between I wrote a novel and the result of being a best-selling book or touching 1,000 people's lives, which would you pick? So impact and results are more real, are more substantive than actions. I swept the floor. Well, it was still dirty. I told the person they should be on time. Well, they're late. The impact and the result of an action is more significant than the action. Because what we're interested in ultimately is results. The action is important if it leads to that result. Meaning, if I say I'm going to go to school and I'm going to spend $200,000 in student debt, and the result will be that I'll be depressed, anxious, unemployed, and default on the debt, the result is more important than the action. If you did another action and said, I'm going to hang around, playing football, enjoying myself immensely, and then I'm going to be gainfully employed with no debt at a local supermarket, you would say the result is more important than the pathway of getting there. It's the ultimate result, an impact of that result. And it's really impact. So you have the actions that are aiming towards a result, that are aiming towards an impact. And it's the impact that matters most. Because if your action is, 100 different things to make $1 million, and the result of all those actions is to be $100,000 in debt, and the impact of being $100,000 in debt is divorce and stress and alcoholism, it's that end result that matters the most. And so in the hierarchy of substance and symbology, the action is important to serve a result. The result is important to create an impact. And it is that ultimate impact that is the most important thing that we're moving towards. In the same way, it's not money that's important. It's not things that are important. It's not services that is important. It's the impact of those services on our lives. We have a direction of the outer reality. Another way of saying this is the outer reality equals the inner state. So if you can choose between a depressed, unhappy, and self-loathing state or a confident, satisfied, self-loving state, the state ultimately is more important than the path of getting there. So you have the outer reality that is in service of an inner state. And Tony Robbins was touching on it, and it's something I found in my own life. There's nothing more miserable than achieving all your goals and being unhappy. And, Robin Williams dealt with this. And it's a very common thing in a materialistic culture to drive oneself to achieve a wide range of goals, only to find that the goal doesn't create the state. And one of the reasons for that is that growing and expanding creates happiness more than arriving. We like being in a dance of growth and expansion. As soon as we start atrophying, we've arrived, our well-being often decreases, and that ties in with what Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, I believe is the word, talks about with flow. When we're in a state of flow and growing, it's one of the highest states of accomplishment. When we're retired and around, we start dying and being unhappy. So outer reality or inner state. This gets back to the core. Would you rather have the trappings of success and feel miserable, or would you rather feel abundant and not have the trappings of success? Well, often they go hand in hand. But the goal, what's more substantive, is the inner state. And this has several layers. The quality of the inner state, having integration, for example, is a very satisfying inner state. It means that you think in the way that you believe in the way that you think, you act in the way that you believe, you act in the way that you think, you speak what you're going to do, then you do what you say you're going to do. When you've got that kind of integrity, there's a lot of peace. There's a lot of harmonic chords in there. When whatever you think you should do, you do the exact opposite, it's a very dissonant chord. So the inner state that emerges from that pattern of behavior is very dissatisfying. Because one of the things that we have is much of reality, and thus much of our reward and punishment systems, our pain, pleasure, reward systems, are culturally generated. And the root word of cult means that element of reality that is repetitive but irrational. It's familiar, but it is insane. And so in the cult-like nature of culture, there are certain behaviors that are rewarded by the cult, but are profoundly dissatisfying to be in that. And one of those may be to, if you're a male, to work 80 hours a week and have one's sole purpose in life be about making money or scoring in bed from time to time. That's not going to be as satisfying as a rich life that might not be rewarded by the cult. If you write poetry, you may find great fulfillment and be completely ignored by the cult, versus you drive by in a gas-guzzling, uncomfortable, noisy Lamborghini, and suddenly this is a great accomplishment where everyone's interested. And you say, well, why? Well, because everyone is. Then you go back into that cult-like nature. Everyone's interested because everyone's interested, and everyone's interested because everyone's interested. And we all want to belong, and Italian sports cars have paved the way in convincing us that somehow you're more of a human being if you sit low to the ground in a noisy, claustrophobic, resource-consuming car that costs $200,000 or $300,000 than if you spend that money providing college educations or pursuing interesting ecological hobbies, which objectively you'd have to say, isn't that a little bit more intelligent? But cults are not intelligent. The cult-like nature of culture is self-referencing. And so in this situation where the outer reality will be rewarded if you do this, but the inner reality suffers, your inner world suffers because it's dissonant to who we are as human beings. It's what's known as the pact with the devil. And ultimately, in that religious overtone, the pact with the devil is giving up what is more meaningful and more impactful for that which is more symbolic and less important. The soul for the body is a good example. Character for more outer image is another example. If I steal this person's thing, I will lose respect for myself. But if I steal it successfully and buy these various things, other people in a materialistic culture may value me more. So you have the compact with the devil is the trading of what is more valuable for that which is more substantive. So within that same veins, you have the contract or the win-win outcome. So if you have a choice between behaving in a way that fulfills the letter of the contract and behaving in a way that creates more win-win outcome, which do you do? Now, if it's a mutual contract, you have to amend the contract, but the understanding is that the whole purpose of a contract is to clarify the relationship so as to ascertain that both people can win before the contract proceeds. That's the point of the contract, to provide an overview. I will do this, you will do this, I will do this, you will do this, and we will all be better off at the end. That's the purpose of the contract. Now, if the contract is not facilitating that, and you can pivot behavior away from the contract in a direction that is win-win. For example, a client promises they're going to pay you, $50,000 once the job is done, and halfway through you learn that their breadwinner has just died and they've got funeral expenses. Well, the contract says that you can continue and be paid, but it may be more win-win to say, look, I don't want you to be out money that you don't have, and I don't want this to be a stress for you at a time of loss. So you've paid me for the half we've done so far. Let's tear up the contract and you can hire me again to finish the job when you've got more money. And this is the transcendence of win-win and the outcome being more important than the contract. The same is true with law. In a democracy, there is not a single law that has been enacted that was not promised to be of benefit to the people. We said this was the law to pass. Naturally, we couldn't foresee every circumstance. And when you get to these situations where the law is causing great harm to very specific and real people and not helping anyone, the question is, do we enforce the law that was created to help people, or do we sublimate the law to do what is beneficial to people? And in an empathic culture, the latter occurs. This occurs more in Thailand, for example, than in the United States. The United States is higher on the sociopathic continuum, and both victims of the law and perpetrators of the law in unhealthy dynamics are often proud to apply completely absurd laws to completely absurd situations for which they were not intended, rather than violate the letter of the law. And in an empathic culture, human beings are more important than the law. The law was created to serve human beings. And when there's a tension, the interests of different people are weighed. The impact is weighed. Mentally, emotionally, physically, financially, etc. So if you have to choose between the law and creating human well-being for all concerned, you can't have a violation of the law that benefits this person and not this other person. But when you have these situations where nobody is harmed by adjusting the law, then the law should be sublimated for the well-being of the people involved. Similarly, would you emphasize or worship the promise or the behavior? I will always love you. That's a word. That's a promise. The behavior, I sleep around, I lie about this, I steal your money. Which of those is more important? It's the behavior. So you always put attention to the densest form of reality. And it's important to understand that all of this is on a continuum. After some of the Kikion experiences, I believe it was Plato, but one of the Greek philosophers was talking about the fact that when you have deeply transcendent inner experiences, as he had, what becomes clear is that this outer reality is a shadow of inner mathematical formulas, of inner beliefs, of inner truths, that what is out here is kind of like a receipt, that you order up these thoughts, these feelings, these contexts, this amount of time, this mass of body, this level of biology. You order that up, and what physical reality is the receipt, the record in dense matter of that inner transaction, of that inner reality. That the real reality is something that we're not conscious of except in rare moments. That we're in the virtual expression of that. And one way of looking at that, at the idea that in a certain sense, to one degree or another, in any polarity, one thing is more real than the other, is, for example, that writing, you see, writing came after sounds. So writing is a symbol of a sound. So in our most abstract form of reality, we might have writing. And then we have the underlying reality of which writing is a derivative. Now, we also look at this in financial markets. One of the reasons that we have periodic financial crisis, and particularly in 2008, is the investment in the derivative rather than the real thing. So when you have a large segment of investors wanting to invest in the derivative of an underlying asset more than they want to invest in the underlying asset. They don't want a house. They don't even want money. But they're buying a derivative of a house so that they can make money, so that they can make more money, so that they can retire, an idea, so that when they retire, they can buy things that then will make them happy. Well, this is a very shaky formula on so many levels, because what they're really wanting is the happiness. And even in that particular narrative, they're ignoring the data that retiring generally makes people more unhappy because it takes people out of flow. And we don't prepare people for healthy relationships in retirement. So the retirement, which is supposed to make you happy, is going to make you less happy. The things that you're going to buy in retirement are not going to deliver the happiness promised in the advertisements. The money is not necessarily the quickest way to buy the things. And you didn't want the house to begin with, you just wanted it to make money. And so you've got maybe 4 levels of derivatives based on false promises that distort the underlying economic system, which is that things are supposed to be valued based on whether people want those things. Not everyone bidding for those things to make more money so that they can retire and do this, but because they actually want things. And in that scenario, you have a bubble. You have enormous level of harm created with this pattern of investing in the symbol rather than the underlying reality. So we have writing, whose underlying, which is a derivative of sound. And we have sound that is a derivative of gestures, because gestures came before sound. Gestures are a derivative of the reality. So if you make a symbol like this, it saves you the time of going over and looking at a tree. But that's not a very precise gesture, and so a sound is a derivative of the gesture. So you have writing, sounds, and gestures. Then you have the reality, meaning the physical pattern of events. But one of the most interesting things about the physical pattern of events is that they're affected enormously by one's sense of meaning. And here's what I mean. Let's take someone who's seeking revenge, who's just been humiliated, who's been felt horrible and small and crazy, and this brutal dictator did all these things, murdered his wife, stole his child, all this stuff. So, and one of the things that happens with human psychology when all of these various traumas build on one another without justice, without recourse, without the ability to have power and dignity in that situation, is the psyche becomes more and more fixated on revenge. With literally people willing to die, as we saw with the 9/11 bombers or suicide bombers, literally willing to die in order to fulfill this singular focus. And so let's say someone is in this state. Well, they can be crawling through a briar patch, bleeding, smelling shit. But if in the process of doing that, they're anticipating the bomb that's going to ruin the other person's life that they've been dedicated to attacking for 10 years, they can be feeling delight completely. It doesn't bother them in the slightest. They're deeply satisfied. Or take another situation where, Viktor Frankl is in a concentration camp. And yet he's learning about psychology. He has a purpose. He's enduring the camps. And out of this comes this statement that has a fair amount of truth in it, that a human being can endure any what for the right why. Is that the outer situation, that if you're sacrificing long hours to help your daughter go to college and you love your daughter, you can do that for 10, 20 years, in complete sacrifice. And parents do that when they're devoted to their children. And children, it's reversed in Eastern cultures. I meet young daughters in Asia sacrificing everything for their parents, doing a job they hate, working for a boss they hate, working hours they hate, putting all that money back to the family. So you can endure any what for the right why. And what this suggests is that meaning is more important than reality. That if you had to choose between, let's say, living in a candy store, but the meaning you ascribe to that is that you're a loser and you're a coward, because the only reason you live in a candy store is you're too terrified. Let's say your uncle owns the candy store, and you don't particularly you hate candy, you don't want to work there. Your real dream is to work with horses, but you're terrified of failure. So the only reason you're in the candy store is because you're too terrified to face your fear of failure. And so the candy store becomes a symbol of your own cowardice. And if that's the meaning that the candy store is for you, that every time you see that candy store, you see a coward who won't pursue their dream, you will come to hate the candy store. Now, by contrast, military boot camp is, by most people's standards, a horrific 4-week ordeal, trauma, humiliation. But if the meaning that you give to that boot camp is that you are becoming a man or becoming a woman, that you are facing your fears, that you are creating a brave future, that you are protecting your country, if the meaning that you create is that you're becoming somebody, then that meaning transcends the discomfort of 12-hour days of hell. And your state, the final point in this journey, is your inner state. Your state is determined and is referenced. The underlying, the meaning is in a certain sense a derivative of the state. The ultimate goal of every human being is to be in a terrific state where you are proud of who you are being, where you are proud of your impact, where you are proud of this whole process of moving from derivative to reality. And you are in a state that you own, that is you, which you're not in a state about something, because this is two levels of state. You can have a state that is derived from the reality, or you can have a reality that is derived from the state. And that's the last pivot point. They're both in this domain of state, but in one version, I'm happy because I have enough money and because I won this award and because this and that and the other. The last pivot point, of which that is a derivative, is this is who I am. And because this is who I am, I behave in this way. I have these meanings, these narratives. I say these things that integrate with what I do and integrate with what I feel. And I write these things that integrate with what I say. And I keep the agreements that I make from that place. And so, in that sense, There's a foundation of being. And there's one last piece in this process, which is that the conscious mind is choreographed through the lens of language. Thoughts are routed, energy is routed via thoughts that are framed in language. And there is an awareness that comes through language. There is an awareness that comes through language that when we go back to the underlying reality, it is before that language is referencing something that came before language, something that is beyond the conscious mind, something that transcends the conscious domain of verbal thoughts, of verbal meanings, of the names of specific states. The word happy isn't just neutral, meaning the word happy is shaped. It's a charged word that is charged with all the associations. For example, happiness for me includes pretense, because when people say, "Oh, I'm happy," I see them pretending to be happy. I see them adjusting their mouth and putting on a game face to put on the performance of happiness. And so when people say, "Are you happy?" about 30-40% of the physiological associations with that question are all the different interactions I've experienced in this culture around that word. And so, in other words, it's not the true meaning of happiness. It's that true meaning from the dictionary colored by all of the misuses of that word. And so you go back to the truest meaning of the word. And then you go to the silence, out of which all worlds and all words come. All worlds, all words come out of that silence, come out of that space. And when you are the space out of which state expresses itself, out of which state emerges, out of which words are shaped to choreograph the energy as it moves from the unconscious realms to the conscious realms. That is the ultimate reality. And it's fitting that 99% of the space between a proton and an electron is space. It's fitting that in the universe or the multiverse, 99% of all reality is space. It's fitting that what we call the conscious mind has less than 1% of all there is to know, and that 99% of all reality is in the domain of the unknown and the unknown unknown. In other words, 99% of who we are is outside of the lens, outside of the box that defines our sense of self and who we are. Because scientifically, we are not isolated. Psychologically, we are isolated, meaning within our culture, we have created and curated a series of prisms and prisons that create the illusion in which we are distinctly separate from the rest of reality. But there is not a single atom in my clothes, in my things, in my body, in my breath, that cannot be linked to the entire fabric of the universe. There is not a single atom that is not affected if the laws of physics change in one part of the universe, my body changes, as does the relationship of every atom. If the laws of physics change within my body, you see, it's part of an algorithm. It's part of a network of patterns. So that ripples out and affects everything else. In this way, what happens here changes everything else. What happens everywhere else affects what's going on here. So, physically, we cannot make a case for the separation of any of my things from the rest of the universe. From my body, separate from the rest of the universe. One can have distinctions. This body is here, and yet it is connected. I'm breathing the air produced by plants out there, and I die without those plants. I'm fertilizing the plants out there with my feces. Those plants die without fertilizer. I'm eating, and I die without that eating. I'm drinking, and I die without that drinking. My body is part of an organism. It's part of a field. And consciousness is part of this system and this field. Consciousness is also part of the language. The language is also part of the environment. The Eskimo tribes have up to 400 words for snow. Why? Because when you're setting out on a 2-hour journey, knowing if the snow is like this, moving in that direction, or if the snow is like this, moving in that direction, in terms of is ice forming or melting, determines whether you live or not. So in a traumatic culture of extreme cold and snow, you have 400 words for ice, which means you have a consciousness capable of deciphering 400 words and 400 types of snow. So consciousness expands in response to environment. In a rainforest, the tribe can smell certain smells at up to 40 yards. In a thick rainforest, and you can detect certain plants, certain animals from smell. And they have a language to articulate that, and a gesture to articulate that in a way that we do not. We can tell the difference between an iPhone 6 and an iPhone 6S, because that's what's important as a status symbol in our cult, because that's what's important in looking good, looking busy within a Western culture that in many ways values action, frenetic action in particular, over impact. So in this context, we are connected. Our ego emerges out of the void, that ego is a lens to interpret, creating the illusion of separation. Our bodies emerge out of the earth, creating a way to relate to the rest of the body with the illusion of separation. And our cultures and technologies add to that sense of illusion. And yet, it is all part of the algorithm of the matrix of the equation that is this planet. Some hundreds of thousands of years ago, if not millions of years ago, one theory is we began to explore different states of sound and consciousness that our eyes sharpened in acuity, something that's been verified with the psilocybin mushroom. And studies show that the monkeys, the humanoids, at that time experienced heightened sensory awareness when consuming a low dose of a psilocybin mushroom. The mushroom has been shown to correlate with stimulating parts of the brain that facilitate language. So even our culture, even our art, if you look at the Chinese art and its correlation with opium, and the different levels of consciousness responding to the environment, we see a connection, that there's nothing that's happening in isolation. And so the question is always, what do we honor? What do we turn our attention to? And at the end of our journey, the pinnacle, the edge of human consciousness, is to return to that void, to return to the space out of which all things emerge, to return to the presence, to the silence, to the stillness out of which every word comes.